Continuing our exposition with the book of Romans, today we begin chapter 3. Before I begin reading through the text, I would like to draw attention to the fact that when you begin at chapter 3, Paul changes the way he has been dealing with the subject of God's righteousness and circumcision. What you see in chapter 3 are a series of questions that Paul asks. But these questions are asked as if they are being asked in opposition of what the apostle has been saying. So Paul employs this kind or language of speech by anticipating opposition or objections to the truth that he has been setting forth. And so you will see the series of questions in opposition of what he has laid out, and Paul responds to each of those objections. And so we will pick one objection after another. But today we pick chapter 3 verse 1 and 2, which deals with the first objection. What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. In verse 1, Paul responds as if he is opposing, or there is an opposition to what he has been explaining in chapter 2, verse 25, all the way to verse 29. And of course, Paul has made it clear that if your circumcision, if all it is a circumcision of your foreskin, of your private parts, but your heart is not circumcised, that is to no avail. The apostle therefore begins to respond. Perhaps a conclusion could be made out of that argument that he made, that your circumcision must be that of the heart. Does that really do away with the circumcision that was so often spoken of in the Old and even in the New Testament? What advantage has the Jew? If circumcision that was given by God himself in the book of Genesis chapter 17 verse 10 and following, where God commands Abraham that you are to be circumcised, and that is to be a sign between Abraham's descendants and God himself. And God would say to Abraham that that covenant had to be kept throughout all generations. Circumcision was given by God himself. It was God's idea. It was God's command. If therefore then that circumcision that was so practiced as a covenant between God and Abraham and his descendants, if then that circumcision had no avail, if ultimately circumcision was only that which of the heart, what was the purpose for God to give out this command in the first place? What advantage then has the Jew over the Gentile? Because for the Gentile there was no such covenant. There was no such command for circumcision. Now that circumcision is applied to the Gentile, if the Gentile is circumcised in his heart. That's what Paul has been arguing in chapter 2 verse 25 and following. And so in verse 1, he says, what is the profit of circumcision? Is it possible that all of that exercise, the sacrifice, the command and the obedience, is it possible that that profits absolutely nothing? Is the Jew now done away with, now that we are dealing with matters of the heart? No longer matters of the law, no longer matters of circumcision of the foreskin. Listen to Paul's response in verse 2. Much in every way. It is a question that he is asking or responding in response to the objection that the Jew therefore can now be done away with and therefore there is no advantage or there is no profit of being a Jew. Keep in perspective that Paul is talking to the New Testament audience, and that includes you and I, as Gentiles, circumcised in the heart, yes. Do we therefore close all the doors of the privileges given to the Jew? The answer for Paul is no. There is enormous advantage, tremendous advantage. Look at the response he gives. Much in every way. He does not try to split hair to try and find the advantage or the profit, but his response is resounding. That the Jew has advantage and profit much in every way. And those are two words or several words that he uses, compound words that reflect the intensity and the weight of his response. Much, abundance, and in every way, which talks to extent. And so Paul says the Jew has profit and the Jew has advantage much in every way. He goes on to say chiefly. Again, this is a matter of priority and this is a matter of prominence. This is not to say that there are no other profits and that there are no other advantages. But he says one of the most critical ways in which the Jew has profit and advantage over the Gentile, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. It is to them through whom the word of God came. Through them we have Abraham. Abraham is part of the Jewish genealogy. Even Jesus Christ himself forms part of that genealogy. They were given this word of God. They are the ones who were the custodians. The word of God, the law of God was written for them primarily, and only secondarily do we as Gentiles receive the law of God. But we also need to realize here that the word of God was treasured by the Jew, that it was to them that the instructions were given, but they treasured it. They took the word of God and kept it, as it were, in libraries, even if libraries of scrolls, but libraries nevertheless. And generation after generation, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium, they handed down from one generation to another the law of God. And because they were given that grace, the law of God was preserved throughout their generations. And therefore, chiefly, the word of God was committed to them. That's an advantage. That's profit. That's a benefit that the Jew has in the fact that the word of God was given to them. And the word of God is precious. God had to choose this nation. God had to hand over his word that had to be treasured throughout the ages to this small nation that initially had no respect or had not been respected among other nations. It was a small nation, landless, that had to be called out of idolatry. God himself says to this nation that was nobody's, to this nation that consisted of those who were despised, a small nation that was not consequential, to that nation I chose to grant the law for them to preserve for the Gentiles who were yet to come in. And so later on, Paul will argue in chapter 11 of Romans that the Jew has an advantage, and therefore we as Gentiles have been grafted into this Jewish nation, that all the covenants we receive, they emanate from this nation, that God himself through them preserved these covenants. So for the Gentile, we have no place to undermine the Jew. Even though blindness has occurred to them, Paul would argue later on that we are not to be proud because we have only been grafted. This nation is God's firstborn. This nation, through them, God himself handed his word, and the Messiah would still come through them. For you as a Gentile and as a Christian, you are not to undermine the Jew, even though they might not be in a state of faith or in a state of grace. But we are to reverently, in reverence and humility, to pray for them and to recognize that they are indeed that vine which we have only been grafted. The Christian is to be humble and to know that this nation is the custodian. The nation of Israel is the custodian of God's law. Therefore, the benefit, the advantage, and the profit is unto them.